In 2013, Disney and EA signed an exclusive deal for the rights to the Star Wars games. So from 2013 to 2020, EA released 4 games. The first was in 2015, which marked the return of Battlefront. Now I feel like I fall in a large camp of people that were initially excited about the return of this series. The 2 Battlefront games made by Pandemic Studios remain to be 2 of the finest Star Wars games ever made. It captured everything great about the action scenes from the films. You could fight as a Jedi, soldiers, and pilot many vehicles. And with EA's Battlefront, DICE would be at the helm, and honestly, since the original games were modeled after Battlefield, it seemed like this new one would be in good hands. As we got closer to the release, there was some concern. For one, there was no campaign or galactic conquest modes. It would mostly be a multiplayer game, and while the originals were 2, they offered a lot of offline and co-op options to play with bots. Many were disappointed with this title when it released, because it really wasn't the return of an old favorite. It looked and sounded amazing, but was lacking in many areas. Oddly enough, this was one of the few games where I really couldn't get into it at launch, and then found myself giving it a second chance as the DLCs had free weekends. Much of the additional content, though paid, was really good. New modes were added and created awesome intense matches like Extraction, which was endlessly entertaining. Or when they came out with the Death Star DLC that featured a longer match that was made up of 3 shorter ones that ended with the trench run. This stuff was great, but EA also shot itself in the foot since the DLC should have been free to begin with, to not fragment the online community. So while it stumbled out of the gate, I do think it eventually made good on delivering a fun, casual game. But sadly, they were going to repeat the process, but worse, with the next one. EA's Battlefront 2 was aiming to deliver on what they tried to do at the launch with their first attempt. In 2017, they released their sequel, and sadly it delivered something that had some good moments, but was also lacking, along with having issues with how unlocks and monetization worked. This time around, we got a campaign, an original story that showed us a tale from the Empire's perspective, from the Return of the Jedi leading into Episode 7. The campaign does have some bright spots, especially with the Lando mission being one of the best, and at least Luke is done better here than he was in The Last Jedi. But most of the narrative ends up being a good concept that is poorly executed. We follow a new character and her turn from the Empire to the Rebellion, but this is poorly developed and conveyed to the player. She also gets lost in her own narrative, as many of the later missions focus on Han, Luke, and Leia, without properly developing Iden. There are some good action moments, but the campaign ends up feeling like a high-production game that is very poorly written. The co-op offerings were not good as well, along with the multiplayer missing elements and modes that the 2015 game worked hard to provide. And it was really odd that they took out your statistics page, as when I play multiplayer games, it's fun to see how long I've played them or what my KDR is. So this was the second game and things were not looking good for EA, nor was the confidence in them to deliver on the property that they had the rights to. Slowly and thankfully, DICE did stick with Battlefront 2 and really turned it around. The campaign wasn't fixed, but they added on bot options and a really fun co-op horde mode, more multiplayer options, and better progression. By the final patch, this turned into something that was a really good game, with glimpses of the old Battlefront titles. In 2019, Respawn, most known for their first-person shooters, released an action-adventure title called Jedi Fallen Order. This was an original story that took elements from the recent run of Tomb Raider games, along with using Dark Souls as their framework for the combat. Many were really happy with this title, and I think much of that came from Star Wars fans who were really craving for something that was decent, especially at launch. Personally, I found the story to be one of the best aspects about it. It started and ended strong. My main issues came from thinking if this took on an action game style rather than a Souls-like format, it would have fit the Jedi action better. Something more like Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden and less Souls-like. EA's last game under their exclusive deal was Squadrons. This was supposed to be a return to the X-Wing, TIE Fighter, and Rogue Squadron type games. Gameplay was decent, but again, the story was another interesting concept but poorly executed. This was written by the same guy who did Battlefront 2's campaign, and he used the same device by having an Empire soldier turning to the rebels. But I was noticing a pattern that he had good ideas but had no way to turn them into a compelling narrative, and now I'm usually concerned when I see him attached to a project. So over the course of 5 years, EA delivered only 4 games. The first was a bit mixed in its launch, improved a bit through its additional modes, and had a fanbase that enjoyed it. The second one had one of the worst game launches for that year, but it slowly worked towards redemption. The third finally provided something that most Star Wars fans enjoyed, and the last, while not the worst, it could have been a lot better. I truly think that EA failed Star Wars. They were given the sole access to this amazing series that not only has a rich history of wonderful films, and I'm referring to the original trilogy, and yes, I like the prequels as well, but Star Wars has a long history of great original games. Whatever you feel about the prequel films, the games that came out during that time were really awesome. Developers would take an action sequence or an idea from the movies and turn that into a fleshed out game. For example, Episode 1 Pod Racer is a wonderful arcade racer that effectively puts the player in high-speed races. Star Wars Bounty Hunter, while flawed, expanded on and developed one of the more interesting side characters from Attack of the Clones. Republic Commando, seen as one of the best, was a great FPS that allowed players to see the special ops side of the Clone Wars. But EA really didn't do any of this for their titles, nor take the opportunity to provide these experiences to us. In fairness, when looking at the sequel trilogy, there was a lack in creativity across the board, but this is where the game developers and publisher needed to do better. A good example of turning crap and making it into a diamond was X-Men Origins Wolverine. The movie wasn't good, but the game was awesome and delivered a great M-rated Wolverine game, where we finally got to see what those claws could do. So just because what you are basing it on isn't really good doesn't mean that the game has to be bad as well. I would have been happy if EA tried to make a decent movie tie-in game with all the movies that were coming out by Disney. There was loads of potential with Rogue One, with the entire team of people. You could have made a game on each of them and fleshed them out, sort of like how Django was in the Bounty Hunter title. Yes, I enjoyed each of the EA's releases in some respects, but when you look at what they could have done, especially with their exclusive access to those Star Wars games, EA could have done and should have done a lot better. Now, I do want to be fair to EA here. While overall I was disappointed with their 5-year run as a whole, the developers on some of these games really deserve a good amount of credit. For one, with Battlefront 2, that was quite a redemption story. I came back to it once it had the big co-op update, and was enjoying some of the other multiplayer additions, and it was great to see this game come back from where it started. While the fumbled launch should be recognized, so should the work that was put into trying to fix it. EA could have dropped it and just went to Battlefront 3, but instead these developers were able to fix it. Yes, it should have been this way from the launch, but I do think we should always try to give them credit when they try to fix something. And while Jedi Fallen Order lacked polish, it was nice to see a new but good story come from this universe. Something I found odd was it seemed like EA put only a few studios on Star Wars. Some felt spread too thin, like dice between Battlefront and the Battlefield entries. And EA Motive was a new studio put on Star Wars games, but the studio sadly is one that hasn't really proven themselves yet, especially from a storytelling standpoint. Why didn't EA put other studios on to make Star Wars games? Logically, if you have the exclusive rights, you would think that they would be pumping out more games than they did. 4 titles in 5 years is really small. Why wasn't BioWare used to make an RPG outside of the KOTOR MMO? Where were the movie tie-in games or other action-adventure titles? While there were bright spots during EA's tenure, it mostly felt disappointing as the releases were slim, and when they launched, they often did not create a strong first impression. Thankfully, EA no longer has sole access to this series anymore, and many other developers can now make games on these missed opportunities. I wish the new developers the very best of luck, and I hope for some real surprises. What were your thoughts on EA's recent Star Wars releases? Did you enjoy any of them? Did you dislike them? Let me know in the comments below. If you're interested in being notified of new videos, please hit the subscribe button and bell. And if you would like to support the channel and get early access to content, please check out my Patreon. All of the links will be at the end of this video and within the description. And thank you very much for watching.